Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Few of us who have a keen interest in history and literature, particularly Australian history and literature, will not have heard of Henry Lawson and his short story, The Drover's Wife. First published in 1892, Lawson's story centres on an unnamed woman living in the outback in an isolated hut with her 4 children while her husband is away droving. One day she and the children spot a snake disappearing under the house, and to keep her children safe, she puts them to bed on top of the table and with her faithful snake dog Alligator keeps vigil, waiting for the snake to reappear so she can kill it. During the long hours of night, she reflects on her life in the time since her marriage to the drover, giving us a glimpse into the hardships endured by women like her, fighting against the elements, loneliness and other dangers in order to protect her family and home while her husband is away. It's a story that's inspired several adaptations, including an ABC TV adaptation in 1968, and more recently a stage play and novel by Leah Purcell, as well as a movie starring Leah Purcell herself as the drover's wife. Henry Lawson's story also inspired a novel written by my next guest. The Story Thief by debut novelist Kyra Geddes, and published this year by Affirm Press, is a poignant, clever story that explores the space between fact and fiction through Lillian Taylor, a woman born in the very year Lawson published his much-celebrated story. An orphan, Lillian is educated in a convent school in Sydney's eastern suburbs, and upon discovering Lawson's story, is convinced that it's based on her own family and sets out to prove it, dubbing Henry Lawson a story thief. This was a beautifully evocative story, deftly weaving elements of Australian history, culture and literature with one woman's search for the truth and exploration of the importance of telling our stories. And so it is with great pleasure that I welcome Kyra to the podcast today. Hi, Kyra.
Hi, Claudine. Thank you for having me. And what a beautiful summation you just gave.
I wanted to say formally congratulations on this wonderful novel. It is such an epic and rich tale.
Thank you so much. Very much the culmination of a lifetime worth of ambition and a 10-year journey to get to this point. So
that's tenacity, I have to say.
I first came across the idea for the Drover's Wife adaptation, or the retelling, 10 years ago when I was at university. I was studying English and creative writing, and we studied The Drover's Wife in class and some of its best known retellings. And you mentioned a couple of them there. In fact, that tradition started back in the late 70s with writers like Frank Morehouse, Murray Bale and Barbara Jeffries, who gets a mention at the beginning of my novel. And I sort of fancied the idea of throwing my own hat into the ring of that tradition of Drover's Wife retellings. And as you pointed out very eloquently there, Lawson did leave the Drover's Wife unnamed in his story. She's unnamed, as are her 2 daughters, whilst her 2 sons are named, and even the family dog is named. And I was a little bit bothered by that injustice. And that's part of what, spurred me on to come up with my own retelling of the story.
Absolutely fascinating. So the interest started while you were at university studying it, but had you been interested in Henry Lawson's work before that?
No, I have to say no. And it's funny because my degree also took quite a long time. I was studying first in Melbourne and then in Sydney. And I have always loved literature and reading, but I would say I read less Australian literature than I should have or could have. And I wasn't any particular fan of Henry Lawson, nor really of sort of frontier women's stories. But this story is so iconic, and in the end, it just becomes a scaffolding, if you like, for me to tell a different kind of a story about a woman and her path through the first half of the 20th century. So, yeah, that's how I came to it.
I've given the basic premise for this story already, but what I wanted to know was whether you could elaborate for listeners on what this story is about and why Lillian has such a strong reaction to Henry Lawson's The Drover's Wife.
So Lillian is born, as you said, in 1892 as the daughter of a drover, and she lives in the red dirt country of the Australian outback, an unspecified location in outback New South Wales. And that's not a spoiler to say in the very beginning of the novel, in the prologue, she loses her family in a tragic bushfire. She's the only survivor. And she's sent to a convent boarding school in Sydney where she takes comfort in books and she dreams of an independent life as a teacher, which is, a fairly sort of a classic trope, if you like, in literature, and something we can all identify with. And it's there at school at the age of 16 that she first reads The Drover's Wife in class, and she's immediately struck by the parallels with her own family. And she, speaks up in class and claims that Lawson must have met her family and based his story on her family. But of course, nobody believes her because her name's not in it, her mother's name's not in it, nor is her sister's, and she's just a little girl in a school, and why should some important man like that have based his story on her family? So goes stum on that completely and, is so ashamed she never wants to talk about it ever again, but she's determined to prove her suspicions and to reclaim her family story, and that sets her on a mission. So if you like, that's the sort of starting mission, and she goes out there seeking truth and asking the question, really, who has a right to tell a story? And then over the course of her lifetime and 50 years of Australian history, she comes to some perhaps more nuanced and mature conclusions about storytelling and about what her place was in that whole Lawson story. So that's the premise of it.
Ownership of stories is something that comes up time and time again. I mean, there's so much discourse today about writing our own stories and who has the right to write those stories. And in part, that's what Lillian is angry about, as you mentioned before, the fact that she believes Lawson took her family's story and didn't even acknowledge them or name them, but more particularly didn't name her mum and didn't name her and her sister. Whereas, as you said, he's even named the family dog and named the two brothers, but none of the female characters. And I guess in part, that's certainly why, for example, Leah Purcell's adaptation is particularly powerful because she gives the drover's wife an identity that's denied in Lawson's story. Do you want to talk more about that?
I think it is a very topical issue, as you say. I personally, and through Lillian, have come to the conclusion that anyone has the right to tell a story as long as they do so respectfully. And I do think that as writers, especially, it's our job to use our imagination and to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. And so while Lillian starts out angry and calls Henry Lawson a story thief, she later comes to what I regard as a more mature and nuanced understanding that it's in the telling or the retelling that the story becomes our own. Having said that, you do need to tread very respectfully. For example, in this story as well, Henry Lawson, he was quite substantially deaf, for example. So in writing about those aspects of his life and his career, I actually read the works of two deaf academics who write on Henry Lawson. Specifically, there are two around the world in America. So things like that, I think if we as writers, we do the homework and we pay respect and tread carefully, then I do think stories, they're there to be shared and celebrated is how I see it.
I think you've already touched on part of Lillian's character. For many years, as you may have mentioned, she was determined to live a life very different from that of her mother's. She'd resolved never to marry or to have children because she wanted to maintain her independence. And she's lucky to have been presented with an opportunity to attend university in pursuit of that aim. But I would have to say that her fate seems rather intertwined with Henry Lawson in many ways, isn't it?
It is, very much so. What I wanted to do really was, you've got this story that's going forward through history. So Lillian's personal story of love and loss, I wanted that to be set against the backdrop of Australia's coming of age in art and in literature. And we'll come to the art component later, I suppose, with Russell Drysdale, and against the backdrop of Australia as a former British colony. And very specifically, I wanted to situate it within the Henry Lawson Australian storytelling context as well. So just in terms of her fate being intertwined with Henry Lawson, yes, I used his life and his biography. I used some of the key turning points in that as little touchstones for Lillian and story points. And without giving too much away, it's important to know that Henry Lawson's funeral provides a very important turning point in Lillian's life and a moment where she quite literally can lay him to rest and perhaps move forward with other aspects of her own life. You know, what I enjoyed about weaving history and weaving Henry Lawson's biography through it, it wasn't a constraint, it was actually an inspiration. So I would take these details and then I would think, well, how can I weave that into Lillian's world? And for a long time, I mean, I have a whopping big Scrivener document, and I won't even tell you how big that is. But I also had this one document, which I called my fact versus fiction timeline. That's where I put in events of Australian history and Henry Lawson, and have a second column with, what was happening in Lillian's life. And sometimes one drove one, and sometimes one drove, well, Lillian couldn't influence history, unfortunately. Maybe she can influence the future, but not past history. Yes, I really like to look at how they both went together. And I understand too that all historical fiction is a blend of fact and fiction. But I think in the case of The Story Thief, the fact is pretty important. It's very important.
You mentioned Henry Lawson's funeral, and something that I found utterly fascinating. I didn't realize that Henry Lawson was buried in Waverley Cemetery, along with many other notable historical figures. But despite his fame, he died broke and alone, didn't he?
He did. Like a lot of people, a lot of brilliant people in the arts, whether it's in literature or art or poetry or whatever, he was utterly brilliant, but he also was suffering from mental health problems, and he had a terrible addiction to alcohol. And he had this deafness as well, which actually kept him apart from society in some ways. And I think perhaps drinking was a way that he coped with that as well, and his storytelling. Yeah, he was a troubled man. And after his death, there was a great quote by a friend of his called Redgum, who was actually a councillor here on the Ku-ring-gai Council. And he said something like, Henry Lawson had a habit of falling, of stumbling, if you like, a habit of stumbling, but that's neither your affair nor mine. In between his stumbles, he dug in hard, and the result of his digging is with us in black and white. And that's what we have with Henry Lawson. We have all his writing. We have 2,000 pages of his writing. But yeah, he was a very troubled man. I tried to explore a lot of his biography as well as his writing through the story.
And I think you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but the fact that Lillian had such a strong reaction to Lawson's story and was so angry with him for so long. But then once she began to understand that he was a troubled man, that he was deaf, that he was suffering physical and mental illness throughout his life, it softened her, didn't it? It changed the way she viewed him and the story, in fact.
It did. And I think that's something true of youth generally. Sometimes young people can be more judgmental, and sometimes we have to go through life's battles as well to become less judgmental. And I think, yes, when she started to see him as a man and him as a storyteller doing the best he could, which is a line that another character refers to him, she did start to soften in her attitude. Yeah, and move forward to forgiveness and moving forward to, owning her own story.
Yeah, that's such an interesting observation, and such an accurate observation that you made, that I think that, yes, in youth, we are very hasty in our judgments and often harsh in our judgments. And without that life experience of knowing, how life can wear you down sometimes and make you behave in certain ways, that it's not until you're a lot older that you can really appreciate that.
I think that's right. Yes.
So one of the things that Lillian takes strong issue with is that his mother, Louisa Lawson, was quite the writer herself. She published a newspaper and then later published a feminist journal produced by and for women called The Dawn. And in fact, Louisa Lawson was known as the mother of suffrage in New South Wales, none of which I knew about, I have to say, before reading your book. So thank you very much for that illuminating piece of information. But I wanted to ask you, how did this influence Lillian, and why were you so keen to explore this in the context of the novel?
When I did read The Drover's Wife at uni and some of its retellings, I spent a lot of time researching that academic context behind it. So I got to know pretty quickly about Louisa Lawson, and I've read biographies of hers. There is a whole lot of academic scholarship that sits behind all of that. As an English student, as a feminist, as a scholar, I also wanted to retell her history and rewrite her back into the history books. She was a very important woman, as you pointed out there, the mother of suffrage in New South Wales, a very, a high-powered businesswoman, inventor. She even invented a mail strap, I think, that they used for the mailbag deliveries. And she has been recognised some of the time in history. So back in the 1970s, in the first year, International Year of Women, she was included in a postage stamp from Aussie Post. And just last year in Mudgee, the first statue to Louisa Lawson was finally erected, which is really exciting because they were going to put one up in the 1930s and then it just trickled off the scene. Women like that, they were vital in their time, trailblazing women in their time. And yet often they are forgotten and overshadowed by the trailblazing men of their time. The other interesting aspect with Louisa Lawson is that she was a writer, first and foremost, and she also gave voice to her son. She's the one who set his career up. And I like to, and I've explored in the story and also in my author's note there, whether in fact the drover's wife story that he is so well known for, whether in fact it originated with him or whether he may have listened to his mother's stories, and whether it also came from an article or that she had written back in 1896. So as I said, I think in the author's note, it's possible that Henry Lawson did take another woman's story and retell it as his own, but admittedly rather well. He did pretty well out of it.
Suffice it to say that Lillian's life does not follow the path that she'd initially planned and eventually comes to lead a more conventional life. But throughout this, she holds onto her past and she doesn't share her stories with those that she loves the most. I was very intrigued by this aspect of Lillian's character and how she didn't really give her loved ones the chance to know her as they should have. Why was this important to her journey?
Yeah, I think she had to go through that herself. So I think it comes back to when she lost her family back in 1900 in the fire. So being that only survivor, she carried with her a lot of shame. And it's something that I was able to take actually from my own mother's life in a different aspect of her own journey. And so there's that aspect. And then I think because she then had the second amount of shame where she tried to claim ownership of the story in class and was laughed at, she really decided to not tell anyone ever again. But at a later point in her life, she felt that I think she held on to it as something of her own. And she was probably doing what I suggest people shouldn't do, which is that she was holding on to the story as a possession and something that she didn't share. And I think she needed to go through a number of formative experiences before she realized that even if a story is a sad and tragic story, it is better off to be shared, and that there's comfort in that sort of group ownership, moving forward together.
As I mentioned earlier, Kyra, The Story Thief was more than just a tribute or a reaction to Lawson's story, but a touchstone for important events in Australia's history. Things like World War I and World War II, the female suffrage movement and culture, with references to a litany of real life places and characters. So I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate or tell us a little bit about your research and how difficult was it for you to weave all of these different elements into your narrative?
It was both difficult but a great pleasure, I have to say, and it's part of the reason why it was a 10-year journey getting here. The research occurred on so many levels. So if I let me think them through. Okay, on the first level, my research started with reading. And so for me, the greatest truths are found in fiction, not in history books. And so my starting point was to immerse myself in novels that were written in the time about which I was writing. So if Lillian was at boarding school in 1900 to 1909, I was reading Miles Franklin, My Brilliant Career, and Henry Handel Richardson, The Getting of Wisdom. When we get to World War II, for example, Lillian's reading Dimphna Cusack, Florence James, Ruth Park, T.A.G. Hungerford, these sorts of authors. So I really threw myself into their novels because I wanted to see what people living through those times, how they wrote about the events at the time, how they saw them, how they experienced them, and what language they used to talk about them in. So I tried to give my novel quite a classic feel by, using that. So that was the starting point, was the fiction. A second level was, I would say, lived history accounts. So a lot of the real institutions that I chose to feature in the novel, like Sacred Heart, Kincoppal Rose Bay, and Sydney University Women's College, they all have, centenary publications and archival works with a lot of lived history reports. So I read a lot of that. Then, of course, I did read history books as well. But then the last thing of all was the newspapers, which for anyone who knows me is quite ironic because I quite literally don't read newspapers ever. I've always got my nose in a book and not in a newspaper. But I've read all of the newspapers from the, certainly all of the newspapers from the war years. I've read page to page. So when we get to, for example, the final week or two of World War II and they're dropping the nuclear bombs on Japan, I was reading the Sydney Morning Herald, the cover stories each day and the inside stories, and reading also the letters to the editor and the opinion pieces and seeing how were people reacting? How was the church reacting? What did the scientists say? And so it was very interesting to experience that history on a day-by-day basis. And I think you get much more of the emotional flavour than you would out of a history book for that. That's kind of how I approach my research. And of course, with all of that information, how do you then distill that and put that into the book? Without swamping, I would say, without swamping the narrative. That's the important part. It's all in Scrivener documents. And then I would kind of pick a major event in history and then find a way to meld it with whatever story, twist or arc or point in the narrative I wanted to tell, and then just see if I could put it in, and then in the editing process, pull a lot of it back out again, basically. But yeah, it was a very, very comprehensive process.
I feel you on that point, because the temptation to flavor your writing and to flesh out the historical aspects of your story with reference to so many interesting things that are happening and going on at the time must be overwhelming. And yeah, just choosing what to leave in must be as hard.
It's really hard. There were so many wonderful rabbit holes I went down and so many more interesting things I could have said. What I've written here, even though it's quite a large book already, let me assure you, it was a lot longer. And I took a lot of it down myself, and then the good folks at a firm helped me take it down a lot further, because there was more history on, there was more of that history on the page, and we needed to pull away from that and carve the marble so that the story was privileged throughout.
You spoke earlier about, it was so interesting that you used exactly the same words that I have popped down on my question. But my question was, do you feel constrained by the inclusion of history, or did this feel like it made it easier to write Lillian's story? I mean, you talked about Henry Lawson's biography, but I mean, in the context of the wider story and the wider historical events, what do you say?
What did they say? Necessity is the mother of invention. And I like the constraints. I think that of history, that gave me interesting points to use. Sometimes, though, I might have taken Lillian's story in a certain direction, and then I realized major events were happening. And I thought, okay, well, that's not going to make sense that way. So that's when I sort of disappeared down the rabbit holes. Particularly the one time where I struggled a little bit was in World War II. Lillian does undergo a second major loss in World War II. When I realised that she would need to suffer that loss, I realised that was going to dramatically affect the whole rest of the story, and it wasn't something you could gloss over, and it would need to be given its due space and respect in the story. So history has left its mark on this book big time.
Speaking of history, I'll tell you another thing that I didn't know before reading this book was, might show my ignorance, but I didn't know about the Russell Drysdale painting called The Drover's Wife. Finding and inspecting this painting had a very profound impact on Lillian, didn't it? It was kind of like a turning point for her in the story.
It was. So art and nature and anything of beauty becomes a source of Lillian's healing. So in addition to Henry Lawson's story version of The Drover's Wife, that is very well known, there is also this Russell Drysdale painting, which he painted in 1945. It hangs in the National Gallery in Canberra. It's often regarded, or has been spoken about, as our Mona Lisa, but it isn't terribly widely known. So don't worry, you're in the majority of people. It's just that I'm an art lover. So for me, I definitely knew about it, and I knew that I wanted to weave this into the story. Look, I did a lot of art history research. I spoke to curators who knew him. I actually even had his daughter, who's now in her 80s. She read my chapters involving her father's artwork and gave her blessing to it as well. But his artwork's quite interesting, because he later has confirmed to someone that it didn't have anything to do with Lawson's painting. He just did that. It just happened to bear the same name. Drysdale's artwork came about because in the latter years of World War II, there was a big drought going on, but they had to keep it hush-hush because they didn't want to show any weakness to the Japanese. So people weren't allowed to talk about a drought, and it wasn't publicised much. But then at the end of 1945, after the war, the Sydney Morning Herald sent Russell Drysdale out on an expedition into the west of New South Wales to report on the drought. And he did some sketches that Lillian sees in the newspaper. And later on, he turned those sketches into a series of paintings, which went on exhibition at the Macquarie Galleries in Sydney. And she sees that painting, and that, as you said, is a major turning point. I really enjoyed writing those chapters, and I hope that people will maybe even be a bit inspired to look further into art as a result of, just the transformative power that a painting can have on somebody.
It made me want to look it up. I mean, I looked at the sketches in the back of the book you had, but then it made me want to look up the actual painting. Kyra, we talked a lot about writing women back into history, about ownership of stories, and about Lillian's journey throughout this novel. But what would you like readers to take away from this story?
I think it does work on a number of levels. I hope that the book sits somewhere in that sweet spot between commercial and literary fiction, which is where I like to read myself, whilst having those deeper layers of history and art and literature. At the end of the day, I hope it's just a good page-turning story, an emotional story. And certainly the feedback I'm getting is that people are very moved by the story. And so I hope that, people will be moved. And I hope that they'll feel inspired a little bit to look at their own life in a way as a story, and to say, where can I take it? Do I like where my life is going? No, but if not, it's never too late. You can always start a new chapter or a new scene and write a new story for yourself. So it's, it sounds slightly cliched, but I think it is a nice way to think of our lives sometimes, and to see that, we all have that power within us to write ourselves into a different future.
Kyra, there are lots of writers out there who listen to this podcast. And given Story Thief is your debut novel, and as you said, it was kind of 10 years in the making, what tips would you offer to anyone out there looking to get a story published or to start their journey towards publication?
Well, I would say read. I do think, that's the starting point. And when you read, you can read very critically, read deeply, and look at, why do you like a certain author? Why do you like a book? How is it written? What voice is it written in? How is dialogue and characterization shown? So that's a starting point. Then I would say also surround yourself with a writing community. So I have a few writer buddies that I've had for many years, and we support each other along. And then in the last couple of years, I've kind of thrown myself into the local author scene, and that's also a really wonderful support. But I think it's good to, surround yourself with other aspiring writers, and ideally a published author or two, because just to remind yourself that it actually is possible. And then I would say just do some targeted courses to suit where you're at in your learning journey. I mean, in my case, it was an entire second degree, a bachelor degree in arts and English in arts. And then I did courses at the ASA and through the Australian Writers Centre and different things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. Now, speaking of surrounding yourself or, becoming involved in a writing community, you have kind of like taken that a step forward in recent weeks by becoming a book queen. So
I know.
So perhaps you'd like to tell listeners about the book queens and what that means, and what is your role in this?
Absolutely. All right. Well, I was very lucky during my publication journey to be introduced to the lovely Belinda Alexandra, a best-selling historical fiction author who I'm sure you know well. She was my conversation partner for my launch event. And probably about 9 months ago, I'd say, she and Natasha Lester started a group called the Belinda and Natasha Book Club. Within, a week or 10 days, they had over 1,000 members, because they're both very popular authors. And there are now about 1,500. And every month they would interview an author, and members got to be part of like a live Facebook interview process, which is fun. Natasha's actually stepped away from that recently, but that's given Belinda a chance to revamp the club, and she's very kindly invited Jane, Tara and myself to join her. And as you said, I have thrown myself into the author scene, and I do like to socialize. And unfortunately, that got, well, not unfortunately, but I'm now in the category of social butterfly. So that's my role, to be like a roving reporter for the Book Queens with Belinda Alexandra. yeah, my job is to go behind the scenes of the book world and attend author events and different things like that, and just let readers and members just get to see a little bit about the real people and faces behind the books that they love so well. So it is a lot of fun, actually. And now I've got an official excuse to do it as well, beyond my own novel. Yeah, no doubt I'll see you out on the circuit with these things.
Amen. Yes. I do like to get out to lots of events myself, although at times it can feel quite overwhelming. There's so many amazing books coming out and so many wonderful events. And I think, we had a dearth of them for quite some time, obviously with COVID, and people were reluctant to go out, I guess, and mingle. But now it's back with a vengeance, and it feels like every week there's 2 or 3 events that I'm desperate to go to. I can only spread myself so thin.
I hear you. I definitely hear you. We should take it in turns, tag team.
Now, Kyra, are you working on something else at the moment?
That's a big question. Okay, so as we've established, that was a lot of research I did and a big journey in that 10 years. So I'm having a break from the writing and from the research. So this year is really devoted to just trying to get the Story Thief as much kind of noticed as possible. But I do certainly have some other ideas. Certainly there is more to the story to tell. I alluded to those extra words. There are a lot of extra words that I have written already, and there's a lot more of the story that could be told if there was actual appetite in the market for a follow-on. Otherwise, potentially I could write something in the art world space, because that is my happy place. And even in immigrant stories, actually, because I haven't touched on this at all, but my parents are German immigrants, and they lived a quite interesting lifestyle in the 1960s in Andamuka, the opal mining town, where I spent my first couple of years of life, which actually is not too dissimilar to what the Drover's Wife story setting is. So that was part of my own inspiration. So there's no shortage of ideas. I think at the moment it's just a little shortage of time and dare I say, a little energy as well.
That's really refreshing to hear, Kyra, because oftentimes there is a lot of pressure on authors, particularly debut authors, to get that follow-up novel out into the world really quickly, capitalizing on momentum. And so it's refreshing to see somebody kind of taking stock and going, okay, well, I really want to, put as much as I can behind my debut and give myself time.
I feel quite strongly about that, because I think it can be exhausting for authors just lurching from one book to the next. I have now already achieved what was my major life ambition. And to be honest, I didn't actually think too far beyond a novel initially. So, anything beyond this will be a great bonus. We'll just see what the reception is to it all, and whether my family are willing to share me with the rest of the world a bit more.
So what would you say is the best thing about being a published author?
For me, it is the achievement of a life dream, but for me, it's an act of legacy. Now that I'm meeting so many authors, when I read their books, I feel like I know something about their character, even though it's not necessarily biographical. I can tell what sort of person they are and how they think and what they value. And I think I wanted a book as a lasting legacy for my children and their children, so that people could, my descendants could one day see, who was I? Who am I? Big questions.
Wow, I really love that, Kyra. I mean, a lot of people talk to me about, as you have, fulfilling a life's ambition. It's been their dream, about seeing a book on the shelf with their name on it. But nobody's ever really spoken to me about legacy. And I love that. As a mother of 3 children myself, almost all of them adults now, it's an interesting way and a really good way of giving to them something of you.
Yeah, it's an artwork it's enduring and meaningful, and women's work is often is so quickly undone. The things that we might do in our daily routine are undone, and a book can't be undone.
Kyra, what a joy it was to read Lillian's story in The Story Thief, an absolutely enthralling tale with a unique perspective that I thoroughly enjoyed. I wish you every luck with The Story Thief and your future writing projects. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you so much, Claudine. It's been absolutely such a pleasure.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.